Start the recording. All right, Luke, and then I will make you the host. And off we go.
All right. Thank you, Chris. All right, everybody can hear me okay? Nice. Well, it's great to be here. I appreciate you guys inviting me to come talk about my research. It's always kind of fun to have a captive audience when I talk about my research. Like I said, Rockdale, as Chris mentioned, Rockdale has a special place in my heart. I spent my 8th grade through senior year in high school there, and my mom and dad still live there. And I go back fairly regularly, so it's good to be with y'all. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Let's see if I can figure this out. Okay. All right. Is that good? Can everybody see it, Chris? Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk to you guys today about the most curious, mysterious, and interesting plant in American history, in my opinion. And it's one that people don't typically know a lot about, and I think it has had an outsized impact on American history, considering how little we know about it. So I'm not going to talk entirely about American ginseng, but there are several plants I want to kind of get to. But my research, as Chris mentioned, focuses on kind of the environment and how kind of it has interacted with capitalism and how local cultures have kind of worked to use markets, but also how they shape the landscape around them. So it's about plants. This talk is kind of about plants, but it's also about markets and land use in Appalachia. So first of all, I wanted to plug my book. So it actually just became available on pre-order. If anybody is interested, it's going to be out in March of 2022. So I'm pretty excited. This is research I've been doing about 11, 12 years now. And so a lot of the talk that I'm going to be giving is coming from this book. It will be in there in case you don't get all the information down in your notes, and you really want to learn more. But so I'm going to start off. I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role that ginseng has played in the Appalachian region, but also a little bit about my research journey, because I think it's an interesting one. And I know you guys are. I mean, I'm sure many of you have done a lot of research in historical records and genealogy and that sort of thing. So I think you guys can appreciate kind of the story of it, been able to piece together. So it all started back in 2010, when I just started my master's thesis. I was looking for topics to write about, and I wanted to write about Appalachia and kind of the post-Civil War era. And so I started digging through sources. And by digging through sources, I mean, searching for keywords on these databases now, which has totally changed historical research, the ability to just search through these digitized databases with keywords. It's amazing. I probably wouldn't have been able to find what I did without this new technology. But I began kind of searching through the newspapers and looking for all kinds of different articles. But I found several of these curious articles explaining these mysterious people called sang diggers or sangers. And I just wanted to read you a couple of quotes because they're really funny. And you can imagine as I'm reading this, like what are they talking about? So one of them, it might have been this one right here in the Louisville Journal in 1899, said the Sangers are a curious race of mountaineers who inhabit several wild counties of West Virginia. Their origin is unknown. The pure Sanger is a being by himself. Lawful marriage is unknown among them, and they have no use for lawyers, doctors, preachers, or school teachers. They live in the woods and among the rocky fastnesses, far away from highways and civilized settlement. They dig the ginseng root, which is plentiful in the mountains. steal into the nearest settlement by night, and sell it by appointment with their grocer and steal out again with cornmeal and bacon, of which they have learned the value when their small game is scarce. The ginseng is shipped to China where it commands a high price, so they contribute to the commerce of the outside world, after all, and are not altogether useless human beings. And here's another one. The sanger, as the ginseng digger is called, doesn't live anywhere to speak of, but exists in the mountains of Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, and is found running wild in some parts of North Carolina. The sanger is a man of irregular habits and cannot be trusted any too far. Being a cross between a Ku Klux and a moonshiner, he is naturally a devil-may-be fellow at best and handles his gun in the same chilling, restless manner that he does the truth and other people's property. He works about 2 months out of the year digging ginseng and puts in the other 10 kicking himself for it. Having no property of his own, real or personal, he has but little respect for that of others. So a lot of these newspaper articles kind of use the same language, and some of them are actually much more sensational. This is a really interesting one that I found, and forewarned, it does have 19th century writings, fairly racist writing here, but he said, I can remember when I was a boy in Virginia years after the war, hearing the old Negro mammies speak almost in whispers of the mysterious singers of the mountains. They were described as elvish beings who lurked in the fastnesses, always on the watch out for fat babies, which they would carry away to their inaccessible haunts, there to roast and eat them. so I was reading this stuff and thinking, what on earth are they talking about? Is this, is any of this real? I've never heard of these people. I'd heard of ginseng, and I've heard of ginseng diggers. My great grandfather was a ginseng digger up in eastern Kentucky, where my mom's family's from. And I'd go up there for family reunions and whatnot, and they would talk about ginseng. So I was pretty familiar with it. So I was saying, okay, I want to research this. I want to figure out what these people are and who they are and why they're being written about in this way. So that kind of began me on my 11-year journey of looking out for these people or investigating these folks. And I found out pretty quick the reason why I really haven't read anything about them is because, as you might imagine, the sources are quite difficult to find. I looked through all the normal books and reference materials that I had, and there was nothing about them. And other than a few newspaper articles, I didn't know even where to start. So to make a long story short, I have I'm going to go back a little bit here in a second. I found out the best way of researching these folks is through business records. I had this hunch that if they were trading as much ginseng as people were claiming they did, they would be in kind of store records. And so I essentially went on a ginseng expedition myself for several years, kind of traveling around the region, finding these store ledgers and other kind of business records. And this is just these are kind of the store locations of the ledgers that I examined, these crosses right here. So I examined about 40 different store records, and most of the research in the book, or a large part of it, comes from insights gained from these store ledgers, which are a really interesting source. If you guys have ever seen some of these things, you can tell quite a bit from looking at these pages, and I'll show you a few of these pages in a minute. So I'm going to come back to this mystery of who the singers are in a minute, because it took a while to kind of figure out what the story was. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about ginseng and what it is and why it's such a big deal in Appalachia. So here it is, right here. This is on the right is a 4-prong ginseng plant. Every few years, after the ginseng comes up, it'll grow another leaf. So it comes up with just 2 leaves sticking out of the ground, and then after about 5 or 6 years, it adds a 3rd leaf, and then after 3 or 4 more years, it adds a 4th leaf. So these plants can be very old, and some of the early ones, I don't know if there's 50-year-old plants anymore out there, but in the 19th century, these plants have been around for 50, 60, 70 years. And the root is the prized kind of part of the plant. And to give you a real quick history of the ginseng trade, the Chinese have been using ginseng for thousands of years, but they had always used Asian ginseng. And by the 18th century, Asian ginseng had almost disappeared from its native range in Asia, due mainly to overharvesting. But it has an interesting history in Asia too. It actually helped fuel the rise of the Qing dynasty. That was their kind of main source of money, actually, that helped build that empire. But by the early 18th century, Asian ginseng was almost gone, and it just so happened that these Jesuit missionaries discovered that that North America had its own species of ginseng. There was a Jesuit missionary in China named Father Jartu, who basically wrote about this plant and sent it back west, and said this plant, you'd be amazed at how much medicinal value they place in this plant. And it just so happened that another Jesuit missionary in Canada had read that and read his descriptions of the plant, and started looking for it in Canada, and they ended up finding it in Quebec, and so it's a different species of ginseng. They're part of the Panax genus, but this is a distinctly American species of ginseng that had split off from Asian ginseng a few million years ago, before the last ice age, when it migrated over to North America. After these Jesuit missionaries discovered that they were the same plant, they then kind of figured out that the Chinese also valued American ginseng, and so that started this modest trade of ginseng going from Canada to China, and by the 1740s, it had gotten pretty big. So there's the plant. I'm going to move this slide, but remember what it looks like. If you ever find it, I think it's going for about $900 a pound right now. So it's one of the most lucrative wild plants. Well, I guess it's safe to say it is the most lucrative wild plant in North America. Okay, so it turns out, so the first kind of ginseng boom happened in Canada, as I mentioned, about 1720s. And the French Canadians were kind of getting the Iroquois mainly to help dig ginseng for them, and they would ship it back to France, and then it would make its way over to China. But there was a series of ginseng booms, and this is something that I kind of discovered through my research, that this was just the first one, and it gets a lot of the attention. I mean, this is what's been written about the most. If you ever hear of the history of ginseng, it's mostly kind of about Canada. But if you look through the records, I mean, there were several more. Western Pennsylvania, New York, kind of the southern border of Iroquois, by the 1750s. And then kind of right around the end of the American Revolution, through about the 1780s, 1790s, there was a pretty sizable boom in the Ohio Valley, in Western Virginia, and over into Eastern Kentucky, Southern Ohio. And then it comes a little bit later to Western North Carolina, by about 1808. And so I think the role of ginseng in settling this Appalachian frontier, I think is pretty underappreciated by most historians. I've looked at store records in which these country stores that first popped up in the western edge of Virginia were dealing almost exclusively in ginseng. One store, 90% of its revenues, I mean, it's, 90% of what customers use to pay for their goods came from ginseng. So, that's telling me that, I mean, these first, kind of settlers or resettlers, European settlers in the Ohio Valley were finding just beds of ginseng, and they were going out and using that ginseng to buy the things they needed to start a life on the frontier. I mean, they were buying plow points, they were buying saddles, knives, fish hooks, and there's plenty of anecdotal evidence saying that they bought their land. They helped buy their land with ginseng. So it's if you think about, kind of the early Ohio Valley economy, these people hadn't really had time to develop their farms yet. The agricultural kind of economy was not creating a lot of wealth yet, and so, but the ginseng was there. It was wild. It was growing. Anybody could pick it up, and so there was pretty much a craze during this time. One of the most famous ginseng diggers during this time period was Daniel Boone. So Daniel Boone, after he kind of makes a name for himself, blazing the Wilderness Trail, he settles down in Limestone Creek, Kentucky. He starts dealing in ginseng, buying and selling it, and he and his son go out and dig it pretty often. And he was able to accumulate several tons of the root over a few year period. So he was a big time dealer in ginseng. So this is a map that I created. There's not a lot of, I mean, there's very little data on ginseng production in America in the 19th century. The 1840 census, however, was the only census that actually counted ginseng. And I put it in a map, and this is the kind of way it looked like. But the problem is it says ginseng and all other forest products. So it's hard to tell if this up here in Maine or Michigan was actually ginseng, but you do see right here in the central Appalachians, the highest volume of trade, concentrated volume of trade. So ginseng also helped establish our trade relationship with China. But in 1784, right after the Treaty of Paris, ended the American Revolution, we sent a trade expedition to China. And American merchants had done trade with China before, but it had always gone through the British East India Company, right? But now after the Revolution, the U.S. is trying to establish itself as an independent nation that can trade by itself with China. And so the Empress of China was the first ship to sail from the United States to China, and it took several months. But these American merchants kind of had a hard time figuring out what the Chinese wanted that we had, and they eventually figured out that the one thing that we did have was ginseng. And so they put out orders for 30,000 pounds of ginseng, to go to China, and this touched off a kind of part of that boom that I was talking about in Western Virginia. So another kind of little known fact about ginseng and why it's important is, helped establish this trade relationship with China. Okay. So over the course of the antebellum period, ginseng kind of becomes woven into the economies of these small communities in Appalachia. And one of the unique aspects of this trade, and something that I focus on quite a bit in the book, is that these plants, one of the things that makes them unique is that they weren't grown in gardens. People didn't cultivate them. And this is really curious to me, because if you look at all the other commodities that kind of enter these global exchanges, almost all of them, right, are grown on a farm or plantation, right? But this one is growing wild, and I was curious about what are the implications of that, right? What makes that? How does that fact, change the way this commodification process unfolded? And it turns out these plants were harvested from what scholars typically call the commons. And this is it's a socially constructed, kind of institution comprised of overlapping use rights, and it essentially guaranteed that everyone would have access to these forested mountainsides to hunt, to fish, and to gather. And by the early 19th century, everything was owned. I mean, all the land was pretty much owned. I mean, there's very little public domain left in Appalachia, but everyone still kind of worked out these rights to access the forested mountainside. There was kind of this belief that if you didn't improve your land, if you left it up in wild forest, then anyone could come along and gather stuff. I mean, harvest medicinal plants. That you could hunt or fish. You could get honey. You could get feathers. I mean, there was a lot of different these resources that people got from the commons. And so one of the unique characteristics of the ginseng trade was that it was all produced by going out in the woods and hunting for it. And that's what they called it, ginseng hunting. They didn't even call it digging or gathering. They acted like it was hunting. Anyways, we'll come back and talk a little bit more about the commons here in a little bit, because sometimes it did cause tensions over land use, but it was generally well accepted that these plants and these other resources were property of the harvester rather than property of the landowner on which they grew. And my grandmother would always kind of talk about this. I mean, people came up and looked for ginseng on her land, and she would go look for ginseng on the ridge tops where somebody else owned it. So it's a really kind of peculiar little institution that we know very little about because it wasn't written about, it wasn't talked about. So I think one of the things my book does is kind of bring into focus these kind of commons practices. And by the way, if anybody has any questions, I mean, I'll try to answer them as I go along. Otherwise, we can talk about whatever y'all want to talk about after I get done.
Hey, Luke, I have a question.
Sure.
We got a presentation from a lady a couple of years ago that talked about an ethnic group of people called the Melungeons or something like that, that lived in Western North Carolina, Western Virginia. This is the part of the country that you're talking about, right? So did you ever come across that group of people?
Well, no, is the answer. I'm fairly familiar with the Melungeon kind of theory, but it's hard to. Most of what I had was going on was these names and ledgers or census documents, and it's hard to get too. I didn't see any evidence of Melungeons in my sources, but yeah, that's a really interesting story. Okay. So the one kind of data that we do have about ginseng is export numbers. Okay, and that doesn't tell us everything, but it kind of gives us a good sense of the volume of ginseng being exported from this country. And you can see from the 1820s to the 1980s, the exports of wild ginseng reached its peak in the 1870s. Okay, I mean, there is a clear boom here going on right after the Civil War, and so part of my research is exploring, why. I think it's, you could guess, right? The Civil War pretty much destroyed the Appalachian agricultural economy. The livestock on which a lot of Appalachian families depended were now essentially gone. I mean, it takes a little while to rebuild that economy. So the thing about commons use is that it's available kind of whenever people need it. And so whenever there's kind of depressions, high unemployment, you see people, there were people out in the woods kind of, making up for those losses. And this is kind of what happens after the Civil War. So a lot of farms were neglected or abandoned, or a lot of the livestock was run off in the kind of the chaos in the mountains during the war. And so after the war, they came back and kind of tried to rebound by um, going to the woods, digging ginseng. But you can see also here a steep drop off in the 1890s. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So I want to take a minute to talk a little bit more about some of the other plants that were harvested from the commons. And this is another part of my research that I think is fascinating, in that the commons in Appalachian herb gatherers played a pretty big role in stimulating the growth of the pharmaceutical industry. Big pharma, I mean, of course, back then it wasn't big, but kind of the origins of it are very much traced to the forests of Appalachia. And I'm not going to get into too much of this kind of broader medical changes here, but in the 1820s, to make a long story short, there was a kind of a flourishing of demand for indigenous plant medicines. Before this time period, there wasn't a lot of the medical establishment was very slow to embrace kind of local plants in American medicine. They used some plants from Europe and some other ones like cinchona, the bark of cinchona, which becomes quinine from South America, but very little in terms of Native American, indigenous American plants. And so in the 1820s, thanks to a few people like Samuel Thompson, who publishes a new guide to health, the Botanic Family Physician, and then you got things like, Botanic Materia Medica, Physician's Guide. Let's see, the CHEROKEE. I mean, all these things are coming out in the 1840s, 1830s, and it just kind of points to the fact that people were starting to demand more vegetables, as they called them, in their medicines. I mean, this is the age of mercury and bleeding patients, and people were kind of losing faith in that as methods to cure illness, and so they start being attracted to these different kind of movements that are claiming to have some sort of secret to health. And the big common denominator on many of these movements is our plants, our indigenous plants. So as American medicine begins to kind of open up and embrace more indigenous plants in their medicines, there are businesses that start popping up to supply them. And oh yeah, there's some more. Keep coming. There were so many of them. This is also the era of patent medicines, right? And so patent medicines were big by the 1840s, and they get even bigger by the 1880s. And many of these patent medicines, as you can see with this advertisement right here, were advertised their use of native roots and barks and leaves and flowers, and there seemed to be some sort of kind of sentimentalism on using this stuff in the medicine. So a lot of these companies use this kind of language. Someone's liver regulator. There we go. So one of the early companies to start selling mass-made and mass-prepared botanical remedies, and like tinctures and little pills and all these different forms, were the Shakers, who had about a dozen or so communities, mainly around the Midwest and the Northeast. But one of the ones that really gets into herb manufacturing early on is New Lebanon, New York. And so this is some photos from it. But this is a whole, this is a whole kind of different history that I can talk a little bit more about if you guys want to. But the Shakers start realizing that there's demand for prepared medicines, as American medicine starts embracing indigenous plants, the Shakers get involved in preparing them. So they have gardens like this over here in this picture. They had a bunch of gardens where they grew these medicinal plants, and they would prepare them and mainly through tinctures, poultices, and things like that. And then they would ship it out and sell it to doctors, pharmacists, and whoever was starting to embrace these new botanical remedies. And one of the guys that starts taking notice of this Shaker herb production was this man right here, Calvin J. Coles. And I should say that I apologize, but I did tweak this slideshow a little bit after I sent you the handout, Chris. I can send you an updated one if you want. I just kind of added a couple slides in there. But Calvin Coles is, according to my research, again, really not much written about him at all, but according to my research, he is the first to start saying, we have a lot of plants over here in Appalachia, and there is demand for these, what he called crude drugs, or crude botanical drugs, in these emerging pharmaceutical companies. And so I spent a lot of time in Calvin Coles's papers and his business records, and I even mapped some of this using ArcGIS. And so this map right here shows you where his store was, which is kind of near Wilkesboro. What is Wilkesboro now? Just down out of the Blue Ridge. But a lot of his roots were coming from over the Blue Ridge, and he was getting a variety of different kinds of plants. Maybe 2 or 3 dozen different kinds of medicinal plants. And this guy is really, he's a really keen businessman and knows what's going on. He knew these trends were taking place around the country, and he knew that the Blue Ridge has some of the most botanically diverse forests in the country, right? And the reason why it's so botanically diverse has to do with the differing elevations, and also the glacial history of the region and how it escaped glaciation during the last ice age. So it kind of maintained this really rich and diverse plant life. And so he realized that he could get all these plants that were in demand pretty much right up the hill on the Blue Ridge. And so he opened up this network. And so I'm trying to think if I have. Yeah. So this is a picture of one of his ledger sheets, and this happens to be the account of a man named Henry Taylor. And Henry Taylor was he started a store in Valley Crucis near Boone, Boone, North Carolina, in Watauga County. And Taylor would go on to found the Mass General Store, which, if you're around the region, you've seen there's like a dozen of them now in different places, like Waynesville, Nashville, Boone. But so Henry Taylor gets involved in the plant trade really early on, and you can see some of the different plants he's dealing with. Of course, ginseng right here. Right here you got lady's slipper, you got wild ginger, bloodroot, and then mayapple and lobelia. So in addition to ginseng, these plants right here become very heavily traded in these country stores. So people like Henry Taylor would set out a price list. It would have this is what we're going to buy, and the locals would come in and check out the price list and then go get it, bring it back to the store and trade it for whatever kind of stuff they needed. And that would just kind of continue that cycle every season or so. So during the war, there was a kind of kind of a boom in the botanical drug trade, especially in the South. The Union blockade of the Confederacy kind of begins to take its effect early on in the war. And so the Confederate Surgeon General, in order to supply the hospitals and whatnot with medicines, begins kind of soliciting for these for native plants. So it's kind of interesting. The Union relied heavily on more chemical medicines, and if they used plants, they were foreign plants. But in the South is more or less forced to kind of use these indigenous plants. So it really kind of serves as a catalyst, right, for the growth of the trade in the South. Francis Porcher, he writes this pretty big tome in 1863 called Resources of the Southern Fields and Forests, which after the war would become kind of a handbook for people who are interested in getting into this business. So here's a price list set out by the medical purveyors department for roots and herbs, and so they have their own kind of prices for everything. So after the war, people start jumping into this trade, and so you have Calvin Coles right here in Wilkesboro, but pretty quickly spreads further west. Arthur Coles, James Harper. I mean, these are just a few of the big ones. But all these entrepreneurs start buying up a bunch of herbs and sending them to these pharmaceutical companies up north. And so, whereas before, ginseng was probably the only real plant that you could make money from off the commons, but by the post-war era, people can now go into the woods and find bloodroot, mayapple, lady slipper, ginseng. I mean, whatever they can find, more than likely will fetch some sort of price. So in this way, by the turn of the century, the Appalachian region was the most important region in the country for supplying these so-called crude botanical drugs to the pharmaceutical industry. So one of the interesting ones, I won't talk too much about the Wallace brothers, but they become so big that they're starting to talk about how they're the largest wholesale botanical drug dealer in the world. And they're sending, whereas Calvin Coles was buying like 36 different plants, the Wallace brothers were buying like 400 different types of plants. And they had this giant warehouse in Statesville that they opened up. They had kind of exhibitions in the Centennial celebration in Philadelphia in 1876, and they become really famous for that. And so they have a network of about 300 to 400 different country stores that were buying roots and herbs from diggers and then shipping it out to pharmaceutical companies. So they were a big deal for about 20 years. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So for the last, I guess I've got a little bit longer here. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about I'm gonna attempt to explain the sang diggers of Appalachia, right? But you can talk about these markets in general. You can look at these statistics. You can look at export stuff. But it really doesn't get at the identity of these people who are digging ginseng, and so to do that, we really have to kind of dive into the records quite a bit. And so to make the best use of these records, I kind of zoom into 3 communities. So I do like community level study of 3 communities: Cherokee County, where I used to live and teach high school. I mentioned it earlier, in Murphy. And then Boone, Watauga County, and Pocahontas County, West Virginia. So there's kind of 3 different case studies, I guess, that I use. And so the first one, Cherokee County, there are a cluster of sources from Cherokee County from this time period, and this is why I kind of chose it. But one of the more interesting sets of sources were a series of letters written by a man named E.B. Olmsted to his employers up in New York City. And from these letters, you get a really interesting kind of snapshot into the ginseng economy of Cherokee County. So first of all, E.B. Olmsted is living in Washington, D.C. at the end of the Civil War, and he gets into some trouble up there. He actually like steals money from the postal service and disappears and goes down to the mountains, and basically goes there with the intent of becoming rich in the ginseng trade. And he gets money from these this kind of drug firm in New York City. He's like, give me some money, I'll go get you a bunch of ginseng and we'll all get off rich, you know. And so he jumps with both feet into this post-war ginseng, you know, craze, and travels down into Cherokee County, starts asking around, figuring out like, you know, who's digging ginseng around here, and he quickly finds out that there are dozens of other people doing the same thing he is. So several other merchants who are buying it from these diggers, people all over the countryside digging it, you know, and finds out that he's not going to be able to get it for that cheap. He's like, yeah, there's so much competition. We're going to have to pay a premium for this stuff. And so he ends up kind of paying these diggers. It was about, oh gosh, it was about $1 a pound back then, which you know, which was quite a bit. Yeah, so Cherokee County during this time period, I mean, was incredibly dependent on ginseng. If you look at this, I found this statistic from the year 1870, and I found some of these just kind of referencing this report in the Secretary of Agriculture's annual kind of report, and I cross-referenced it with the census data, and basically what they were claiming, if you take all the sources of income in Cherokee County, ginseng was about 9% of the whole economy. Total farm production kind of still was most of it, and then some, you know, still sizable livestock, but ginseng, you know, there was they traded in 25,000 pounds of ginseng that year, you know, so that indicates quite a level of involvement in my take. So if you go to Pocahontas County, West Virginia, you get some really interesting sources. And I found, you know, I found some really revealing stuff in Isaac McNeil's store, which is right there on the Greenbrier River. And I'm just going to show you a few of these people that I found, but essentially, as I started looking through these ledgers, I'm realizing that, you know, these are the ginseng diggers that I was reading about. These are the people that are digging large amounts of ginseng and trading it, you know, for most of what they use, or most of what they bought from the store. So, you know, it's always abbreviated as sang right here, but I kind of blew this up right here. But, you know, you can see sang, you know, sang, all through here. Right? And if you did a statistical analysis real quick, you know, Henry Adkison's income over this is about a 2-year period. Yeah, about a 2.5 year period was ginseng, yeah, chestnuts, some beef products, and then cash, butter, and you can see it right here. So again, a big part of his kind of personal economy. And then if you look at somebody like Josiah Cline, I mean, he's trading nothing but ginseng, you know. So if you look at all these references to sang, is what his all his credits. Oh, sorry, all his credits are coming from ginseng. And if you look at what he's buying too, I wish I had a pointer, I'd be pointing this stuff out, but if you're looking at what he's buying, you know, he's buying corn, you know, he's buying pork, he's buying butter, you know, he's buying, you know, things that he could be producing on a farm, right? If he had a farm. So it kind of lends me to believe that this guy probably didn't have much of a farm. I mean, he was buying everything he needed. with ginseng. And, you know, I found kind of several more people like this in the ledger book. So, and it, you know, it took about 6-7 years, but I feel like I had finally found kind of these sand diggers of Appalachia in the historical record. Sorry, I'm gonna be jumping around. I keep forgetting what I had next. You know, as I started researching Pocahontas County in western or eastern West Virginia, I'm starting to realize that this is, I mean, there were a lot of people who were just really dependent on ginseng. So this is kind of the heartland, so to speak, of the sangers, the sang diggers of Appalachia. And people had a distinct routine with this. They would kind of get together with a few other families, and they would go spend a month or two in the fall hunting ginseng, and they would camp out, and some, you know, they would go to mountains that are a little bit far from their home. You know, that they had to go further and further from their home because, you know, the ginseng would get dug out. You know, it would disappear after over harvesting, and so they kind of had to go further and further about. And so by the 1870s, was just kind of this frantic search for ginseng, you know, wherever they could find it, which was often way deep in the woods. And I mentioned the commons, you know, the commons system that supported the ginseng trade. And it, you know, this use of other people's property to harvest ginseng, as you might imagine, I mean, occasionally led to tensions over who owned these plants. And so by the 1870s and 1880s, there was this increasing you know, clash between those folks that were still treating the mountains as commons, you know, to dig ginseng, and those landowners that wanted to kind of protect the resources on their own property and exclude other people from it. And so one of the flashpoints in this debate was an 1873 bill from West Virginia that basically made it illegal for people to dig ginseng or other medical roots from the land of other people without the consent of the owner. And this, you know, has its own kind of real interesting history. But this definitely suggests that there were landowners who were ready to kind of end this common right, you know, to ginseng. But if you look at the way they respond, the way that so this is kind of a rare instance in which ginseng diggers and their voices reach the media. So a newspaper kind of caught on to this story and started and published their response to this ginseng law. And apparently these ginseng diggers got together in Pocahontas County and came up with these resolves. And they're kind of funny. So whereas the cows roam the forest and eat the grass on the common, the sheep can feed on the mountainsides by a natural and indefensible right. And whereas we as human beings created in the image of our creator have been placed below the level of the cow and the sheep, the only brute put on a level with us being the hog by the Democratic legislature of West Virginia, depriving us of our natural right to dig ginseng. Right? So again, it felt like they had a right to these common lands. Therefore, resolved that said legislature was made up mostly of asses. Further resolved that although we are Democrats, we will never vote another Democratic ticket until the same law is repealed. And so there was quite a bit of backlash here. And so this is good because, I mean, people never really articulated their defense of the commons, you know, because most people it was just practice. It was just routine, the way they lived, you know. So only if it was being threatened did they kind of respond with this language of common rights or commons. So the last little community I want to talk about is up near Boone, right? So the Valley Crucis area where the Taylor and Moore store were, which is now the Mass General store. And as I mentioned, if you look into the ledgers of these businesses, you find people like Henry Webb, right? Where, you know, most of what he's buying is with ginseng or wild ginger or angelico, mayapple, right? And so unlike some of these other folks who might have just had access to ginseng, he had access to a lot of different plants. because Watauga County was kind of the center of the crude botanical drug trade. So here's an interesting kind of pie chart here that I'm sorry it's a little difficult to read. I need to kind of redo this, but this is a statistical analysis of a store owned by George Washington Harper in northwestern North Carolina for about a period of about 5 years, and this took quite a bit of time to get all this in a spreadsheet. But this is the results of it. You can see from this whole right side, all of these are wild plants, you know. So a big chunk of the commodities that were bartered at his store were from the commons, you know, from destined for the botanical drug trade. So, but you can also see the variety available to these folks, right? To access the consumer economy. They had all kinds of resources at their, you know, at their command if they were able to go out and find it. You know. So, you know, to wrap this kind of up, the era of the commons kind of comes to an end in some ways by the turn of the century. And by World War II, it was no longer recognizable, at least the root and herb gathering commons. You can see the exports for ginseng just suffer a big drop by the 1890s. The price for ginseng starts skyrocketing. So the post-Civil War ginseng boom was taking its toll. You know, I mean, there was just very little wild ginseng left. And whereas other people were digging wild plants to go send them to the pharmaceutical companies, by the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, you know, the medicine, antibiotics have been introduced, right? Other kind of synthesized medicines have been introduced. So this reliance on crude plants just takes a nosedive by the post-war period. So, you know, there was a period of kind of struggle over ginseng as it disappeared. People wanted to start growing it in gardens. People wanted to start fencing off their ginseng. And I found several kind of stories of people wandering into ginseng patches and getting shot, you know. There was some physical kind of confrontations over ginseng between those who were still wanting to treat it as a common, still wanting to go dig it wherever they found it, and those landowners who were trying to, you know, A, kind of preserve their ginseng on their property, and B, make money doing it, right? So in some ways, it was somewhat of a big culture shift in terms of land use in Appalachia. This just assumed natural right to ginseng was delivered at quite a big of a blow, and of course now it's illegal to dig ginseng anywhere without written permission of the property owner on your persons, right? So the commons looks a lot different now. I mean, yeah, I think that let's see. Yeah, that pretty much wraps it up. I mean, I think the history of the ginseng trade and the botanical drug trade in general is a fascinating story. I mean, it played an important role in frontier settlement, kind of the functioning of local economies, and you know, it gave people without, you know, who didn't own a lot of land or own any land, kind of access to the market. So it's a good story if you're interested in learning more about it. My book's coming out. I also have a website that I kind of maintain. It's called thesouthernhighlander.org. But as I mentioned, it'll be available in March of 2022. And I think that's I think that's about it. So we can chat for however long you guys want to chat. If you have any questions or want to discuss any of this, I'll be here. Let me stop this share. Okay.
Yeah, look, I have a question about the map that you showed us where all the ginseng was found,
Yeah.
up and down the Appalachia. Did you find any evidence of of a migratory pattern, a migration pattern, or people that would follow the ginseng trail, if you will?
That is a good question. And I found references to people who were involved in the ginseng trade in Pennsylvania and New York, coming down into Western Virginia to dig ginseng. But that's about it. As I mentioned, yeah, not a lot of sources to reveal much. It's always just kind of snapshots here and there. But I suspect that was happening, and I do know that the Iroquois themselves actually helped spread it from Quebec and then down into New York and Pennsylvania as well. But yeah, good question.
Luke,
Yes.
this bill that was passed in 1873, did that stand up against the resolution against it?
Yes. So the bill was eventually became law. The West Virginia bill that you're talking about, that I was talking about, in what? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, you said that in 1874 they tried to repeal it, but they weren't successful then in repealing it.
Right. Yeah. So that law generated such opposition, which it's kind of foreign, I think, to us. I mean, it seems pretty reasonable, right? You can't go on somebody else's property and dig their plants. Yeah. But back then, when that was proposed, it initially applied to the whole state. Like when it was being debated, it was like this blanket bill, nobody can dig ginseng. But it generated such opposition around the state that the bill sponsors had to amend it to where it only applied to 3 counties. It's like Pocahontas, Webster, Greenbrier County, or whatever. And so, but it left a provision in there that other counties could also could apply to have it apply to their counties too. But no other county ever did that, or at least not until the next ginseng law was passed, 30 years later.
Okay, yeah. Because I was wondering, how did they continue to do it, even if it was, on the books to stop it?
Yeah,
Okay.
I've looked at the actual court records of those counties to see if anybody was ever charged under this law, and I didn't find anything. So I kind of get the sense that it was really difficult to enforce, because people just, they went undetected for the most part.
Right, thank you.
Sure, yeah, good question.
I have a question.
All right.
When you talked about how valuable ginseng was there ever, did you find anything in your research to show that there was an attempt to farm ginseng, to grow it?
Yes, that's a fascinating story. So people had been trying to cultivate it since the 18th century. People like William Byrd, John Bartram. I mean, some of these kind of, pretty famous scientific individuals who were members of like the Royal Society. There was this conversation going on in the 1750s, like, we got to figure out how to cultivate this. People Bartram shipped a bunch of, actually, I'm not sure if it was Bartram. One of the early botanists shipped a bunch of ginseng roots over to England to see if they could grow in gardens there. So that was part of their vision, was that if they could just start big farms full of ginseng, they could make all this money. But it never happened. And first of all, William Byrd tried to do it, but it was on the Virginia Peninsula, which is pretty hot. It's not in the ginseng's range, historic range. And so it didn't work. He said it just never came up. And I find a lot of these references to like, he tried to cultivate it, but it just never came up. So there was some of that. There was some kind of ecological reasons why people had a hard time cultivating this plant. but one of the big reasons is that it takes a while to grow into merchantable size. You know, at least, I mean, they say at least 5 years, but really it should be like 10 years to get a good sized root. So, you know, people don't really, I mean, there's a lot of people that didn't want to bother with that for, you know, 5-10 years. So that also played a role as well. And then of course, I also found references to people who were trying to like at least just steward a patch of ginseng on their own property. That's kind of what it became, was like, let's try to fence this off where it's growing wild, and try to just steward it and build up the population. But most of those were stolen basically before they were sold. So, yeah, it's a good. I mean, the struggle to try to cultivate ginseng is an interesting story that I'm sure has a lot more of a history than I was able to uncover in the sources. Thanks.
Can you go back to one of your pie charts? I want to see how much in your the display of medicinal products, tobacco was in there, because I think tobacco was used as a medicinal for cattle. I think it was at one time too, right?
Yeah, that's right. Let's see. So let me see if I can. Okay. So, all right. So this one down here.
Yes, that one.
Okay. Yeah. Let's see. Tobacco. Yeah, some of this is just a little off. I need to straighten it out.
It's okay.
Iron. I will say, I mean, I know that tobacco does appear in these ledgers.
Okay.
I don't know if they made it into this one or not. I don't see it.
Yeah, I'm just saying, given that you're in North Carolina and Virginia, where tobacco is grown, that I would expect to see some of that crop coming over also for sale, or being put on for sale, or brought to market for sale.
That's true. I mean, that's a good point. Didn't see it a lot at Harper's store.
Okay.
I don't know why. Cool. Have any of you used the store ledgers for kind of genealogy research or anything like that? I mean, they're kind of interesting to get into.
Yeah.
They're sometimes pretty difficult to decipher, but they can tell you a lot.
Yeah.
And they all have, you know, usually like the list of accounts at the beginning of the book, so you can find a person's name pretty easily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'd be a great resource if you're from that area too. A great way of finding family. Very good. Yeah.
And a lot of these old stores will have a lot of old ledgers. I mean, I found several just by going up to these stores that have been around 100 years and saying, "You got any old store ledgers laying around?" And local history museums as well.
Enjoyed your presentation, Luke. You're very knowledgeable. Do a great job.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good to see you. How are you?
I'm doing fine.
Yes,
Understand
thank you.
enjoy
Very
Statesville.
interesting.
Very good. Do we have any more questions for Luke? If not, Luke, thank you for your preparation and speaking to us today. It was a wonderful presentation for us to learn about the ginseng trade. Very good.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.